May 8, 1945. London is sealed behind police cordons. Whitehall is closed to the public. Inside, offices are lit by lamps that have not been turned off for days. Germany has surrendered. Victory in Europe is official. Outside, crowds are assembling, waiting for the Prime Minister to appear and mark the end of the war. None of that reaches the room where the decision is made. In a secure office away from the celebrations, Winston Churchill meets with the British Chiefs of Staff. There are no journalists present. No speeches are prepared. No ceremonial language is used. This is not a victory meeting. It is procedural. Maps lie folded on the table. Typed memoranda are stacked and passed between hands. The atmosphere is restrained, professional, and tense. Churchill does not open with congratulations. He does not revisit the war that has just ended. He issues an instruction. He authorizes the preparation of a full-scale military offensive against the Soviet Union. The order is read aloud. It is explicit. This is not a defensive contingency. It is not an academic exercise. It is not framed as a worst-case scenario. The target is the Red Army. The objective is to compel Soviet compliance in Eastern Europe through direct military pressure. A start date is specified, July 1st, 1945. Less than 8 weeks away. The operation already has a name. Operation Unthinkable. Those in the room understand the meaning immediately. The Soviet Union is still fully mobilized. Its armies occupy Eastern Europe and much of Germany. British and American forces are exhausted, reorganizing, and beginning the process of demobilization. The war against Japan is still ongoing. None of this alters the instruction. Churchill does not argue strategy in this meeting. He does not debate feasibility. He does not ask whether the plan is wise. He does not invite dissent. He requests an assessment. The Chiefs of Staff are ordered to produce a detailed operational plan within weeks. Force ratios, timetables, logistical requirements, probable outcomes. Political risks are not discussed here. Moral considerations are not raised. The task is technical. Military logic only. No announcement is made. No ally is informed. The public remains unaware. Outside, London prepares to celebrate the end of 6 years of war. Inside, the British government quietly authorizes planning for the next one. The decision is recorded, classified, and filed. The order stands. At the moment the order was issued, the military situation in Europe was uniquely exposed. For the first and last time, every major land army on the continent was fully deployed, fully visible, and largely exhausted. Germany had collapsed as a state, but its territory had not gone quiet. Millions of soldiers were still under arms. Supply networks still functioned. Rail hubs, depots, airfields, and command centers remained intact enough to sustain large-scale operations. The infrastructure of total war was still in place, waiting for new direction. From a purely military standpoint, this created a window that would never open again. The Red Army was massed forward. Its strength lay in numbers, momentum, and depth, but that strength carried structural rigidity. Soviet forces were deployed for occupation and consolidation, not maneuver defense. Their frontline units were extended deep into Central Europe, tied to long supply lines running back through Poland and the Western Soviet Union. Logistics depended heavily on rail networks stretched across devastated terrain. Fuel, ammunition, and replacements moved along predictable corridors. Disruption at the front would ripple backward immediately. Western Allied forces, by contrast, were compact and concentrated. Their supply lines ran west, not east, anchored to secure ports in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Naval control was absolute. There was no threat to Atlantic logistics. Communications were superior, command structures intact, coordination practiced through years of coalition warfare. No Allied army in Europe faced imminent logistical collapse. Timing mattered more than numbers. Every week favored the Soviet Union. Each delay allowed further consolidation, reinforcement, and political entrenchment in Eastern Europe. Every month widened the numerical gap as American units prepared for redeployment to the Pacific and British forces thinned under demobilization pressure. If action were to be taken, it had to be immediate. Delay would erase the opportunity entirely. Geography reinforced the calculation. The line between Allied and Soviet forces ran through Germany, across open plains with few natural barriers. Rivers flowed east to west, offering limited defensive value to a force advancing from the west. There were no mountain chains separating the armies, no fortified belts prepared for defense against a Western assault. Any initial engagement would be decided by speed and coordination, not terrain. Air power further shaped the moment. Western Allied air forces had not suffered the same degree of attrition as Soviet aviation in the final battles against Germany. They retained large numbers of long-range bombers, tactical aircraft, and established airfields across Western Europe and Britain. The Red Air Force was formidable in close support, but less suited for deep interdiction and strategic disruption. In the opening phase of a conflict, air superiority would almost certainly rest with the Western Allies. No one involved believed this would produce decisive victory. That was not the objective. The concept was coercive, not annihilative. The aim was to impose immediate pressure, disrupt Soviet deployments, and force political reconsideration before the Red Army could reorient. Success depended on surprise, unity of command, and the exploitation of temporary imbalance. There was one additional factor that made the moment singular. German military manpower still existed. Millions of soldiers had surrendered in the West. Their formations were broken, their command structures dissolved, but their experience remained intact. They understood Soviet doctrine, Soviet tactics, and Soviet operational habits better than any Western force. As a reservoir of trained manpower, they represented latent capacity that would soon disappear into captivity or civilian life. At this stage, this was not yet a proposal. It was an observation recorded by planners tasked with evaluating all available resources. It underscored the immediacy of the window. Once German forces dispersed, once Allied armies demobilized, once Soviet units entrenched and reorganized, the balance would harden beyond reach. The opportunity did not rest on optimism. It rested on transience. Even at its most favorable moment, the opening was narrow, dangerous, and temporary. The planners understood the reality beneath the maps and figures. The odds were severe. The risks were extreme. But from a strictly military perspective, stripped of politics and morality, the opportunity was real. That was the opportunity placed on the table. Churchill's assessment of the coming confrontation was deliberate and sequential. He did not act from impulse or shock. By the spring of 1945, he had already concluded that the alliance formed to defeat Germany was collapsing under its own contradictions. Military dispositions confirmed what diplomacy had made unavoidable. At Yalta in February, Churchill had watched the military reality translate directly into political outcome. The Red Army's presence in Eastern Europe dictated the terms. Commitments to free elections were written down, but the means to enforce them were absent. He noted the imbalance immediately. Agreements without leverage were not agreements at all. They were acknowledgments of defeat delayed by language. Churchill recorded this internally, not rhetorically. Poland, the original cause of Britain's entry into the war, was being surrendered in practice while victory was still being negotiated. He did not misread the moment. He understood that once Germany fell, the Soviet Union would have no incentive to retreat, compromise, or dismantle its forward positions. The war had eliminated one threat and elevated another. When Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, Churchill recalculated again. The change in American leadership altered the political environment, but not the military facts. Truman was untested and unfamiliar with Stalin. That uncertainty cut both ways. It offered a chance for recalibration, but also risked paralysis. Churchill did not wait to see which path Washington would take. He moved first, within the authority he still possessed. His instruction to the chiefs of staff was not a demand for advocacy. It was a demand for clarity. He wanted to know whether force could still shape outcome. Not whether it should, but whether it could. He insisted on concrete answers, force ratios, axes of advance, sustainment timelines, expected Soviet reactions. Vague warnings were insufficient. Optimism was irrelevant. Only feasibility mattered. Churchill understood the limitations immediately. Allied forces were tired. Political pressure for demobilization was rising by the day. American divisions were already scheduled for redeployment to the Pacific. British manpower was strained to the edge. He did not ignore these constraints. He incorporated them. He also recognized that conventional assumptions guaranteed failure. A frontal contest of mass against mass would collapse under Soviet numerical superiority. If pressure were to be applied at all, it would have to exploit asymmetry, surprise, air dominance, command coordination, speed before consolidation. This is where Churchill's preparation became controversial even within his own staff. He acknowledged openly that Allied manpower alone was insufficient. The numbers did not work. He therefore directed planners to consider an option that would otherwise be unthinkable: the temporary rearmament of German formations that had surrendered to the Western Allies. This was not proposed as rehabilitation or alliance. It was framed as expedient capacity. These were experienced soldiers with recent combat knowledge of Soviet methods, terrain, and command behavior. Their formations were disbanded, but their institutional memory remained intact. Churchill treated this as a military variable, not a political statement. He understood the risks. Loyalty could not be assumed. Public reaction would be explosive. Moral authority would be compromised. None of that changed the arithmetic. If coercion required leverage, leverage required force, and force required numbers. The proposal was not an endorsement. It was an acknowledgement of scarcity. Churchill also anticipated counterarguments before they were raised. He did not expect American enthusiasm. He knew the United States had already borne the largest share of casualties and was focused on Japan. He understood that any operation lacking firm American commitment would collapse politically even if it succeeded tactically. This did not stop him from asking the question. It defined the urgency of the answer. Throughout this process, Churchill did not indulge in fantasy. He did not plan for victory. He planned for effect. The objective was not to defeat the Soviet Union militarily. It was to impose enough immediate cost to alter political behavior before the balance hardened irreversibly. Pressure, not occupation. Shock, not conquest. His preparation reflected this restraint. Timelines were short. Objectives were limited. There was no concept of sustained continental war beyond the initial phase. That absence was not oversight. It was admission. He knew Britain could not fight another total war. What Churchill demanded from his planners was not reassurance. It was confirmation of boundaries. How far could force reach before it collapsed under its own weight? Where did military logic end and political reality begin? He was testing the last remaining margin between the two. By the time the chiefs of staff began their calculations, Churchill already suspected the answer. He did not require belief. He required proof. Churchill's directive entered a system that was not designed to execute it. Once the chiefs of staff began their assessment, military logic immediately collided with institutional and political reality. The obstacle was not a single objection or personality. It was the structure of the alliance itself. The planners' first calculations exposed the imbalance without ambiguity. On paper, Western Allied forces in Europe amounted to roughly 4 million men, organized into fewer than 50 effective divisions. Opposing them were more than 7 million Soviet troops, deployed across approximately 170 divisions. The disparity extended beyond manpower. Soviet armor, artillery, and tactical aviation outnumbered Western equivalents by wide margins. Even under favorable assumptions, the opening phase of an Allied offensive would face an enemy with overwhelming depth. This assessment did not end the discussion. It reframed it. If military feasibility alone had governed the decision, the file could have been closed immediately. But feasibility was not the only variable in play. Churchill's authority did not exist in isolation. It was constrained by alliance management, public expectation, and institutional memory forged during 6 years of coalition warfare. The British chiefs of staff were acutely aware of these constraints. They had spent the war navigating not only German resistance, but the constant tension between British prestige and American power. Britain no longer dominated the alliance militarily, yet it insisted on parity and influence. Every major decision had been shaped by that imbalance. Operation Unthinkable was no exception. American participation was indispensable. Without it, no operation of this scale could proceed. Yet American commitment could not be assumed. The United States had entered the war later, mobilized faster, and was now preparing to pivot toward Japan. Casualty tolerance was finite. Public expectations were fixed on peace in Europe, not renewed war against a former ally. Any sudden escalation risked immediate political backlash in Washington. This uncertainty imposed limits before a single order could be issued. The planners understood that even a tactically successful opening would fail if American support wavered. Britain did not possess the manpower or industrial depth to sustain a continental war alone. The specter of isolation was not theoretical. It was a structural risk embedded in every calculation. Institutional caution reinforced this restraint. Allied command structures had been built on consensus, not unilateral action. The experience of managing figures like Montgomery had left lasting scars. British political leadership had repeatedly intervened to protect national prestige, even when military logic argued otherwise. American commanders had tolerated inefficiency and friction to preserve alliance cohesion. That habit could not be discarded overnight. The proposal to rearm German troops sharpened these tensions. From a purely operational perspective, it addressed a numerical shortfall. From an institutional perspective, it was explosive. It threatened to fracture Allied moral authority, undermine occupation policy, and provoke domestic outrage. More critically, it risked alienating the United States at the exact moment its participation was essential. No planner could ignore the precedent set weeks earlier at the Elbe. American forces had been halted short of Berlin for political reasons, despite clear military opportunity. The decision had demonstrated the hierarchy of priorities unmistakably. Avoiding direct confrontation with the Soviet Union had taken precedence over battlefield advantage. Operation Unthinkable proposed to reverse that logic entirely. The chiefs of staff did not moralize this contradiction. They documented it. Their assessments repeatedly returned to the same conclusion. Any offensive against the Red Army would escalate beyond British control almost immediately. Even if initial objectives were limited, Soviet counteraction would not be. The alliance would be tested at precisely the moment it was weakest. Fear played a role, but not fear of combat. It was fear of cascading failure. Fear that one decision would trigger withdrawals, resignations, parliamentary revolt, and alliance rupture. Fear that Britain would bear responsibility for igniting a new war it could not finish and might not survive intact. No single voice vetoed the plan. There was no dramatic refusal, no confrontation between civilian and military authority. Instead, the operation was suffocated by accumulated constraints. Each scenario produced operational movement, followed by political collapse. Each assumed unity that could not be guaranteed. Churchill listened to these assessments without protest. He did not accuse his planners of timidity. He did not insist on revisions designed to manufacture optimism. He had asked for the limits. They had delivered them. Operation Unthinkable was not overruled by a decision. It was neutralized by a system built to prevent exactly this kind of rupture. Alliance politics, institutional caution, and the memory of recent near failures combined to impose a ceiling on action that military logic alone could not breach. The battlefield never entered the equation. The outcome was determined before a single movement order could be written. The consequences unfolded without gunfire. They arrived through paper, calculation, and restraint. Once the chiefs of staff completed their assessment, the outcome was no longer ambiguous. Every scenario, regardless of variation, converged on the same trajectory. An Allied offensive could begin with momentum. Surprise might be achieved. Initial contact could favor Western forces. Disruption along the forward Soviet line was plausible. Local withdrawals could be forced. Rail nodes could be damaged. Command confusion could be induced. None of this was denied. None of it altered the structure beneath. The Red Army was built for absorption. Its doctrine did not rely on holding every mile of ground. It relied on depth, replacement, and escalation. Losses were not anomalies to be avoided. They were anticipated inputs. Against Germany, Soviet forces had already demonstrated their willingness to retreat temporarily, reorganize, and return with greater mass. The planners concluded the same pattern would assert itself here. Once the initial shock passed, the counterstroke would begin. Soviet reserves were vast. Units stationed in Poland, the Balkans, and Western Russia were not committed to frontline occupation duties and could be redeployed westward. Rail systems, though strained, were sufficient for mass movement. Industrial output, already redirected toward sustained warfare, could replenish losses faster than Western planners could impose them. The numerical imbalance would not shrink. It would widen. As Soviet forces reoriented, pressure would be applied not through a single decisive thrust, but through overlapping advances designed to stretch Allied cohesion. The Western Front, compact by design, would become a liability. Every mile of advance eastward would lengthen supply lines and reduce flexibility. Defensive preparations for such a reversal did not exist. They had not been planned, because the war was supposed to be over. Geography now worked against the initiator. The plains of northern Germany offered no natural defensive depth. Rivers ran laterally, not longitudinally. There were no mountain barriers to anchor a defense. Once forced onto the defensive, Western armies would be required to hold ground they had never intended to defend. Air power would delay, not decide. Western air forces could impose costs, disrupt movements, and attrit advancing units. They could not halt mass ground forces indefinitely. Soviet aviation losses could be absorbed. Airfields could be replaced. Aircraft production would continue. Attrition favored the side with greater tolerance for it. Casualties would follow predictably. As losses mounted, political consequences would accelerate. Public support in Britain and the United States had been conditioned on final victory. Soldiers were already being told they would return home. Families were preparing for peace. A renewed war, against a former ally no less, would encounter resistance almost immediately. Demobilization schedules would collide with battlefield necessity. Units earmarked for return would be forced to remain. American focus on the Pacific would fracture. Pressure to withdraw would rise with each casualty report. The planners did not speculate about this. They projected it from recent experience. Political tolerance for prolonged sacrifice was not infinite. The report traced the consequences further west. If Soviet counteroffensives succeeded, Allied forces would be pushed back toward the Rhine. Ports would come under threat. Supply throughput would narrow. The possibility of a sustained Soviet advance to the North Sea was not dismissed. It was identified as a worst-case scenario, but not an implausible one under prolonged pressure. Britain's position was addressed separately and bluntly. In the event of Allied reversal, the British Isles would not be immune. Not invasion in the traditional sense, but coercion, air pressure, naval harassment, political destabilization. Britain's post-war exhaustion would be exposed quickly. Its ability to endure prolonged pressure without decisive American backing was questionable. The rearmed German contingents, intended as a force multiplier, introduced additional risk. Their effectiveness was uncertain. Their loyalty could not be guaranteed. Their presence would undermine Allied legitimacy and fracture the moral authority Britain had claimed throughout the war. Instead of isolating the Soviet Union, their use risked isolating Britain diplomatically. The planners returned repeatedly to inevitability. Even under favorable assumptions, even with early success, the long-term balance favored the Soviet Union. Industrial depth, manpower reserves, and political tolerance for loss all lay decisively on one side. The operation's objectives were limited, but its consequences were not. The report's final sections abandoned hypotheticals. They summarized. The operation could not guarantee the liberation of Eastern Europe. It could guarantee escalation. It could not secure compliance. It could provoke total war. The risks were disproportionate to any achievable outcome. When Churchill received the assessment, he did not challenge its premises. He did not demand revisions designed to soften conclusions. He did not accuse his staff of pessimism. The document had answered the question he had posed. Operation Unthinkable would not fail at execution. It would fail at initiation. The consequence was not a battle fought and lost. It was a withdrawal made in silence. The plan was shelved. The files were sealed. No announcement followed. No explanation was given. The war against the Soviet Union did not begin on July 1st, 1945. Instead, the existing line hardened. Soviet forces remained where they stood. Governments aligned with Moscow consolidated power across Eastern Europe. Borders solidified. Occupation regimes became permanent. The political reality Churchill had feared became fixed. What followed was not open war, but something more durable. A divided continent. A frozen confrontation. A conflict measured in decades rather than campaigns. All of it traced back to a decision that was examined, calculated, and then set aside. The consequence of Operation Unthinkable was not what happened. It was what could no longer happen once the moment passed. The post-war record closed the file without ambiguity. For decades, Operation Unthinkable remained buried beneath classification stamps and deliberate silence. Official histories made no mention of it. Parliamentary records were silent. Churchill's public speeches from the period gave no hint that, on the day of victory, Britain had contemplated war with its largest ally. The evidence emerged slowly and only after political necessity had faded. When British government archives were opened in the late 1990s, the planning documents surfaced intact. Memoranda from the chiefs of staff, operational assessments, force ratio tables, and briefing papers confirmed that the directive had been real, formal, and specific. The proposed start date of July 1st, 1945, was documented. The target was identified without euphemism. The Red Army was named explicitly. The objective was coercion through force. There was no ambiguity in intent. This had not been a defensive contingency dressed up as planning discipline. It had been an exploration of offensive war. The documents also confirmed restraint. Once the assessments were completed, no execution orders followed. No revisions were requested. No alternative phasing was proposed. The file simply stopped. Planning ceased, and classification deepened. The absence of further action was itself the conclusion. Later memoirs from senior British officers reinforced this interpretation. Chiefs of staff who participated in the planning described the work as technically thorough and strategically sobering. They did not describe internal dissent or moral protest. They described arithmetic, numbers that could not be reconciled, risks that could not be bounded, consequences that could not be controlled. American records aligned with this picture. There was no evidence of a parallel operational commitment from Washington. No joint planning effort was initiated. No combined chiefs directive followed. The silence was mutual and telling. Whatever Churchill hoped might emerge politically, it did not translate into alliance consensus. The geopolitical consequences unfolded exactly along the lines the planners had projected. The Red Army remained in place across Eastern Europe. Provisional governments hardened into permanent regimes aligned with Moscow. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were reorganized under Soviet supervision. Western leverage was absent. Military pressure was never applied. Diplomatic protests followed predictable paths and predictable limits. Churchill's fears, recorded privately during the planning period, were borne out. The Soviet Union did not withdraw voluntarily. Elections were managed. Opposition figures disappeared. Borders were sealed. What had been fluid in May 1945 became fixed by 1947. Operation Unthinkable had been conceived as a tool to prevent this outcome. Its abandonment did not cause the division of Europe. It failed to prevent it. The post-war record makes one further point unavoidable. The plan's existence did not reflect recklessness. It reflected recognition of closure. Churchill understood that once demobilization began, once American focus shifted decisively to the Pacific and then home, once Soviet armies dug in, no credible military option would remain. Operation Unthinkable was an attempt to measure the last remaining margin before power settled into permanence. The documents show that he accepted the answer. There was no attempt to revive the plan later. No reconsideration during the Berlin blockade. No resurrection during the early Cold War. By then, the balance had moved too far. The moment had passed irreversibly. In public, Churchill would later speak of an iron curtain descending across Europe. Privately, the record shows he had already measured the cost of trying to stop it by force and concluded that Britain could not pay it. The post-war evidence closes the case. Operation Unthinkable was not myth, rumor, or exaggeration. It was real. It was detailed. It was restrained. And it was deliberately abandoned. The consequence of that decision did not appear in July 1945. It appeared in the shape of Europe for the next 46 years. The case closes without ambiguity. Winston Churchill authorized planning for a war that could not be fought. He did so with full awareness of the risks, the numbers, and the limits of British power. The directive was not impulsive. It was analytical. It was an attempt to measure whether force could still shape a political outcome before that possibility vanished. The answer was no. Operation Unthinkable revealed the boundary between foresight and feasibility. The military logic was clear. The Soviet Union held decisive advantages in manpower, depth, and tolerance for loss. Any Western offensive, no matter how sharp its opening, would escalate into a war Britain could not control and likely could not survive without total American commitment. That commitment did not exist. Churchill's judgment of Soviet intentions was accurate. His assessment of the coming division of Europe proved correct. What failed was not perception, but leverage. Britain no longer possessed the means to impose outcomes by force. The war had redistributed power, and the planning documents acknowledged that reality without sentiment. Operation Unthinkable was conceived, analyzed, and abandoned within weeks. It produced no battles, no casualties, no headlines. Its consequences were political and permanent. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. The Allied wartime coalition fractured into opposing blocs. The Cold War replaced open conflict with structured hostility. This was not a missed victory. It was an avoided catastrophe. Churchill did not retreat because he lacked resolve. He retreated because the system around him made execution impossible without national ruin. The plan stands as evidence of a moment when ambition confronted arithmetic and yielded. No further action followed. No alternative emerged. The record ends where the planners stopped writing. The file remains closed. If you want to explore more command room decisions that reshaped the war without ever reaching the battlefield, subscribe to the channel and leave your perspective in the comments.